Funding for Dos Bueno is provided by viewers like you. I have a Patreon linked in the description if you like what I do here. Howdy and welcome back to a Morrowind Retrospective. This is the third part in a series. You don't have to watch the rest of it if you don't want, but it will contain additional context that will set up this part better. Today we will be covering Morrowind's progression and leveling system, and how it's a really nice progression system that, when working as intended, makes for one of the best RPG experiences that you can have to this day. But this is a Bethesda game after all, so working as intended is not at all a given. Before we get into that though, it's worth recapping the conditions that Morrowind was developed under. Morrowind was Bethesda's last gasp, their last chance at making some money and saving themselves from being a bankrupt shovelware developer for the rest of time. Development allegedly, according to developer interviews, was somewhat chaotic and poorly organized. There seems to have been a lack of communication between developers, as several aspects of the game don't really seem to mesh together as well as they could, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the general game progression of Morrowind. So let's start out with the least broken part of progression, the leveling system. Characters in Morrowind have several attributes, each of which govern a set of skills. Strength makes your character hit harder, agility makes you hit more often, endurance gives you extra HP and stamina, speed makes you faster, intelligence gives you more mana, willpower makes your chance to cast spells better, personality makes people like you, and luck makes you very slightly better at literally everything. Every time you level up, you get to select 3 of these to get an increase. To level up, you select 10 skills at character creation, your major and minor skills, which can contribute to level ups. Each level requires 10 skill increases, and each skill increases either by using it or by training it for money at an NPC. Each stat has several skills attached to it, with the exception of luck, and every level, each time you increase a skill, you get a point of XP in the stat that governs it. The XP points roughly stack up to where you get 1 stat point for every 2 skill increases, up to a limit of 5 stat points per stat. You also have miscellaneous skills, which cannot level you up, but can contribute XP points to their stats. So the optimal level for a Morrowind character is to either increase 30 skills, 10 each and 3 stats, or 20 skills with 10 and 2 stats, and then your third increase going into luck, which can only go up by 1 point per level no matter what. Now, Morrowind isn't nearly harsh enough to require you to min-max these skills, unlike certain Bethesda games, so you don't need to stress about this at all on your first playthrough, not really. The level cap for Morrowind ranges between 60 and 80-ish, depending on how exactly you build your class, and you can easily beat the game and both expansions at around level 30 to 40, so you can always go and get more levels if you feel like you need those stat points for whatever reason. For a first playthrough, I generally recommend leveling speed and endurance early on. That will smooth out the early game really well. Agility can be swapped in for either of those stats if you're having trouble hitting enemies. Not much in the game is leveled to the player character, so unlike some Bethesda games, you actually always feel like you are getting more powerful every time you level up, even if you mess up and get a bunch of +3s and +4s instead of +5s for your level up. It's not a huge deal. We will need to cover some other aspects of progression before we can talk about the exact place where this system breaks down. It's completely fine in isolation, a bit more complicated than it honestly should be and frighteningly unintuitive, but fine. I spent the majority of my life being convinced that the stat increases in Morrowind and Oblivion were randomly assigned out of a lack of understanding of the system. The Elder Scrolls has become kind of attached to this skill-based leveling system, and honestly, I'm not a huge fan of it. It works well enough if you don't really understand it, but it's heavily exploitable at best, and at worst, it can actively sabotage the gameplay experience and cause severe frustration. Bethesda's Fallout games, and now Starfield and, well, most of the video game industry, use a conventional XP-based leveling system for a good reason. The second major broken aspect of Morrowind's progression is gear. All the levels in the world aren't much good if your fit is mid, so finding and acquiring the best items possible is a major part of the gameplay loop. Unlike Oblivion or Skyrim, where the overwhelming majority of loot is randomly dropped by enemies or boss chests at the end of dungeons, every piece of gear better than the absolute garbage bin bottom tier is hand-placed by the developers in Morrowind. Instead of grinding up until every single enemy or boss chest is full of in-game items, you instead have to quest out in the world to acquire these items from specific locations. The lack of level scaling or randomization causes the first, super major progression problem in Morrowind, the Ice Blade effect. The Ice Blade effect, named for the endgame sword, the Ice Blade of the Monarch, is when the power level of an item is in no way proportionate to how difficult it is to acquire. The Ice Blade itself is a very, very powerful weapon, intended to be acquired deep into the Imperial Cult questline, an obscure and strangely difficult to find questline. It deals endgame physical damage, has a very powerful frost damage enchantment, an effect that most enemies in the base game have very little resistance to. It is one of my most used weapons in the middle phase of a playthrough before I start making myself in-game uber mega custom enchanted weapons. So for all of this awesome power, you would think that it would be pretty hard to get, right? Requiring many difficult quests and possibly one hell of a fight. Perhaps a long journey into the depths of Red Mountain, an inhospitable hell land filled with in-game enemies. No, it's on a random level 15 wizard wearing no armor in a dungeon about 3 minutes from a fast travel point. It is comically easy for any level 8 or so up character to just stumble into this dungeon on accident and absolutely punk this wizard without really expending any significant effort at all. Claiming a weapon that is honestly scaled for a character above level 20 and bypassing a sizable amount of the game's intended gear progression. There are many, many examples like this with very powerful best-in-slot items sitting in random caves guarded by low-level mobs that are never really more difficult than the ones you get in any other random dungeon. This makes the content density of Morrowind, which we talked about in the last part of the series as a positive, it makes it a bit of a double-edged sword. You are constantly being called to explore these caves, dungeons, and ruins, but you run a very real chance of stumbling into in-game rewards from an entire other questline in just a random dungeon and fucking up your entire gear progression. This is why I generally recommend that new players don't do random freelance adventuring at all until they have completed one of the game's questlines. Each questline is intended to reward you with endgame equipment that will get you through the rest of the game, and each questline is an appropriate amount of effort to go to get these items, so you never jump the progression curve the way that you do by roaming into random caves and picking up Daedric armor. However, because God is dead, there is another progression issue tied to faction questlines. Each faction in Morrowind has skill requirements. Put simply, if you don't have any skills at a high enough level that are appropriate for the organization, you can't get very far in it. This keeps the Skyrim thing from happening where your character can complete the Mage's Guild without casting a spell or the Thieves Guild without really doing any immoral theft. This is a good system, and the fact that each rank requires a greater and greater amount of skill out of the player character is appropriate. You actually have to be a master of magic to be the master of the Mage's Guild. However, these requirements can sometimes lead to a disruption, as the requirement of 90 in a skill for the highest rank is really high, and if you are playing as intended and you are avoiding freelance adventuring, training your skill up to that level can be hard. It's particularly annoying because master trainers, trainers capable of raising a skill to 100, are hard to come by and are not really signposted. Some of them make sense, go to the biggest fighty man area to get the highest blunt weapon skill, but others are just some orc in the middle of nowhere or some guy in some bar. There is no real in-game way to easily find a master trainer, which can lead to some unbearable grinding, particularly for magic skills. So, the faction quests expect you to do freelance adventuring to find master trainers, raise your skill, and get money to buy training, but if you do this, you run the constant risk of stumbling into an in-game piece of armor or a weapon that will jackhammer down Morrowind's already somewhat tenuous challenge curve. There was clearly a lot of miscommunication between different people during Morrowind's very chaotic development, and progression is where this is felt the hardest. No one really seems to have had a great idea of how hard the game was actually supposed to be, and there probably wasn't a ton of time to playtest how easy it was to stumble onto these things or how long-term progression for a character would work. It just got lost in the shuffle. This is a huge source of inner conflict for me because I do deeply prefer this loot system, and when you do actually randomly find a really powerful item that you didn't know was there and that you can use for the rest of the game, it feels fucking awesome. Every artifact and high-end piece of gear in Morrowind feels appropriately good, and they all have their uses. These sorts of artifacts in later test games would see significant nerfs as they were folded into the general progression system, the leveling system of those games. And god-tier artifacts that could define an entire character in Morrowind are churned past as part of that leveling system, which just doesn't sit right with me. Artifacts should be special, they should be significant, and they should be very, very powerful. So seeing, a level 10 version of one of these artifacts in Oblivion as a stepping stone on your way to bigger and better weapons just feels fundamentally wrong to me. Now, none of this gear stuff would be nearly as much of a problem were it not for the fact that the highest end, even regular equipment, let alone artifacts, that being glass, ebony, and Daedric armor and Daedric weapons, are so incredibly powerful compared to all of the lower tiers in the game. For an example, in Oblivion, the very best heavy armor in the game, Daedric, has about twice the armor rating as the worst heavy armor in the game, Iron. In Morrowind, Daedric armor has 8 times as much armor rating as Iron armor, and they occupy the same places on the progression curve. The possessed thing about this is that in Oblivion, or most games, if you have incremental upgrades like this, each set in between will be placed relatively evenly. You will rarely get a League of Legends power spike where you get an item and suddenly are multiple times more powerful than you used to be. Morrowind doesn't work this way. The difference between Dwemer, the third best armor in the game, and Ebony, the second best in the game, is that Ebony is 3 times as powerful, with 60 armor rating compared to 20, which Dwemer has. Dwemer is only marginally better than the tier below it, because the tier below it has an armor rating of 18, which is marginally better than the tier below that, which has 15. There's a fairly smooth curve of effectiveness between the various early game armors, and then there's just this titanic power spike between them and the end game sets. This means that if you find one of these better armor sets earlier than you should, you are now multiple times more powerful than you should be, rather than just being a little bit more powerful like you would expect. Now, the same problem exists for light armor, but for light armor, the issue is somehow substantially worse. The second best set of light armor in Morrowind is Chitin, which you can literally buy for pocket change in the first town you start out in. The best set of light armor is 5 times as powerful and is the only upgrade you can get outside of unique items. This is completely possessed by a demon and means that the light armor character is going to spend a huge amount of time with either bad, trashy early game armor or random mega powered end game armor. There is nothing in between. This effectiveness curve from worst set to best set is honestly unacceptably lopsided and leads to another massive power spike when you get that glass armor upgrade. The only armor type that even has a vaguely decent effectiveness curve is medium armor, which is why I usually recommend using it to new players. You start with chainmail, work up to bone mold and dragon scale, and then to orcish, and finally finishing off with either the Endril armor or one of the medium armor sets from the DLC, possibly with a piece or two of Drew armor in there. There are also a lot of really effective medium armor artifacts in Morrowind, so you do still have a proper endgame option, even though you are much less likely to get that massive armor set wide power spike. It is the only armor set that lets you get incremental upgrades throughout your entire playthrough that are actually incremental rather than having a massive jump, which I love. Now, despite weapons having the exact same materials system, this doesn't happen nearly as much. Non-artifact late-game weapons tend to do 2 or 3 times as much damage as the early-game sets, and each material and weapon type is fairly evenly spaced to give a decent curve of damage between each tier. The issue is that late-game ebony weapons are decently common, with a sizable portion of dungeons having some, and they're pretty easy to steal from NPCs. Daedric weapons and armor are appropriately rare. You can still stumble into them on accident, but it does feel more like a reward because of how unique they are, and unlike a lot of artifacts, Daedric weapons and armor are intended to be hidden for the most part, so they are quite hard to find. That said, the jump in power between Daedric weapons and the sort of mid-grade Dwemer and glass weapons is less big than the jump between those mid-grade glass weapons and an endgame artifact, so finding a Daedric weapon feels more like a reward and less like destroying your game progression. The actual problem with the abundance of ebony weapons isn't their power, but how they tie into the next problem. That next problem, the third major problem with Morrowind's progression, is the game's economic systems. It's fundamentally broken. I will not be covering significant exploits here, but yes, I do know that alchemy on its own breaks the game's entire economy, and I am well aware of that. Morrowind's economy by default is sort of decently set up. The most expensive items always cost significantly more than any merchant actually has to pay you for them, so you will nearly always have to take a significant loss on an item, or you'll have to trade it for other items that merchant has that you want. Trading with NPCs will be your major source of income for most of the game. Crest rewards don't scale terribly well, and selling random glass and ebony weapons you have picked up and do not need is a big part of that. However, there are two really major issues with this system and the way it is implemented, and here they are. Look at them. To explain, these two perfidious little creatures, a random scamp named Creeper who lives in a city with a fast travel point, and a random crab named Crab who lives on a barren island in the middle of fucking nowhere, completely annihilate the game's economic system beyond all hope of repair. Mud Crab is incredibly hard to find and access, but he has 10,000 gold, tied for the highest merchant gold in the base game, and he's a crab. To explain why it is important that he is a crab, it's important to know how Morrowind organizes itself behind the scenes. Basically, there is a distinction in the engine between NPCs, those are characters who are one of the races that you, the player, can play as, and creatures, those being basically any character with a completely unique model, such as Vivek or Yagram, or any character that shares a character model with a common non-human enemy. The engine has different stat systems for both of them, with NPCs having much more stats, having more or less the same stats and skills as the player, with a couple more to regulate how they react to things. Creatures lack several important stats though, like skills. They also lack disposition, so as far as the game is concerned, they don't have any opinion of you. This means that Mudcrab has no mercantile skill at all and no disposition, so all of the merchant and commerce systems that the game has that prevent you from selling items at full price do not work, and Mudcrab will buy every single item from you for full price, up to a max of 10,000 gold per item. Now, this is only really a problem for established players because finding Mudcrab in the first place is a pain in the ass even if you know where he is, and he looks exactly the same as every other crab, so honestly most people, even you, probably killed him on accident on their first playthrough. Creeper is where it all breaks down. Creeper was, no shit, added secretly as the result of a bet that one of the developers made with their friend, with the dev promising to put them in the game if they lost. The dev lost. And honestly, the fact that they represented their friend with a tiny little shit goblin who makes a ton of shrill and annoying noises and says, "I'm creeping," honestly says a lot about that specific interpersonal relationship. The issue is, Creeper has 5,000 gold and is a creature merchant, the same as Mudcrab. This makes him theoretically half as damaging as Mudcrab, but there are plenty of tricks to get your full 30,000 gold out of him for a random late game weapon. The big issue with Creeper, with this random shit scamp who was snuck in as a joke, is that he's very, very easy to access and to stumble across on accident. Unlike Mudcrab, he is right in the middle of a city, and as he is surrounded by friendly NPCs and is obviously not attacking, it is much less likely that the player will shank him to death by accident or on reflex. Generally, the player is extremely lucky to get a quarter of the value of any item out of an NPC, but now they can get 100% of that value from the very start of the game if they know which town he's in, or if they just go to that town and start exploring. You will still eventually hit the point where you have enough money for anything you could ever want in the game without using Creeper or Mudcrab, but Creeper and Mudcrab accelerate the process so ridiculously fast that it isn't even funny. I generally advise against using the creature merchants on a first playthrough at all, as they will completely sabotage your game. Now, there is an issue though. All of these previous problems have been implying that if you're playing the game in the intended, God-given Bethesda way, you will have a smooth and even curve of difficulty from the start of the game to the end. This isn't true. Morrowind is incredibly fucking hard in the early game and then laughably easy in the late game. There's a brief window around level 10 to 15 where you feel appropriately challenged by the game. The game then kind of just runs out of new things to challenge you with around level 15 and never really rises to reach the power level of an in-game Morrowind character. By the time you reach Red Mountain towards the end of the game, if you did anything other than just main quest blitzing it with no breaks, you're going to grossly overpower even the incredibly tough and in-game enemies contained within it. Dagoth final villain and channel mascot, is only level 30, and honestly, he's a supremely underwhelming fight. The expansions, well, they certainly tried to reach the power level of in-game characters. Now, the expansions on the whole are a topic for another day, but we will talk about the way that they try to challenge late game characters. Tribunal juices up the stats on all of its monsters and encounters extremely high, and it sort of works sometimes, but Blood Moon just says fuck it and throws dozens of enemies at you at the same time. See this little blue goblin on a pig? He has 100 more HP than Dagoth and regenerates health at a pretty rapid pace. There are approximately 40 of them oinking their way towards you at any given moment that you're on Solstheim. The problem is that killing them takes a really long time at the best of times, and it gets very, very frustrating when you're just trying to get across the map to do like a fetch quest. I usually just end up with a giant train of them and then purge them all in one go when I get bored of having them follow me. Morrowind enemies have pretty simplistic AI and are not really able to make good use of magic or range attacks, so they tend to blur together as sacks of hit points and damage. There are exceptions, with greater bonewalkers in particular putting the fear of God in me in a way that no other RPG enemy can, but they are pretty few and far between, and on the whole, the game seems to be underutilizing all the ways that it could have made its enemies very interesting, and just gave them more health for the most part. Now, all of these problems being said, the very early game, your first few main quests, your first faction quest line, if you manage to avoid stumbling into the sword that slays the darkness in the trash can behind the local Denny's, it works really well. You get an excellent sense of discovery and a feeling like a vulnerable, scared foreigner in a strange land. Each small upgrade you get feels hard-earned, and the sheer unremittent difficulty of the early game makes the JoJo anime bullshit that you get up to late game feel so much better. Bethesda obviously had to do some triage during the development of Morrowind, and they chose to make sure that the early game was really fun the first, 10 hours or so. They were actively going out of business, and making sure that the first part of the game was good enough that you wouldn't try to refund it was a great call. By the time any of the things I have mentioned here start becoming an issue, you're usually already bitten by the Morrowind bug and are probably going to finish the game anyway, even if the late game progression and difficulty is all out of whack. And honestly, a lot of people didn't finish Morrowind back in the day, just played the early parts, sometimes several times over, trying new characters and builds and just adventuring. That is where the game is at its strongest, and the more modern view of I want to complete everything in this game possibly on one character is what makes these issues bubble up to the surface. I'm not saying that this modern view is wrong or the wrong way to play, it's the view I have. I like to do everything I can in a game. It's just that the game wasn't really designed to accommodate that style of gameplay. The best way to just bypass all of these problems is to do each questline with a completely new character. If you beat the Fighters Guild, make a new guy for the Morag Tong or House Redoran instead of just powering through with the same character. This will keep you low powered, which is what the game is expecting of you. The issue of random artifacts being far too easy to adventure into will still exist, but if you're only going to have it on one character for one questline, then that item could just be like part of the character for you. The game fails at preventing you from cheesing it and breaking its progression, so it's kind of up to you how much of that broken progression you are willing to accept. I generally try to put some limitations on myself or try to get into character and do role playing, but that's not for everyone, and Bethesda themselves would choose to try and smooth things out to remove as many of these issues as they could in their future games, even though I don't think they really succeeded for the most part. Now, I generally dislike games forcing me to limit myself to avoid exploiting their broken systems so that I can have a good time, because I am pretty vulnerable to just cheesing games out. I sometimes will just do the optimal thing over and over, even if it isn't a ton of fun, simply because I struggle to deliberately choose to use worse options rather than just using the good one that I know. This is 100% a skill issue on my part, but Morrowind is probably the game that takes the most self-control not to cheese. Progression is very fragile throughout, and the early game is super hard, so knowing that at any time I could walk into 2 low-level dungeons and a couple manor houses and leave with the power of God and an endgame stat array is always in the back of my head. This is mostly an issue for replays of Morrowind though. Most of the progression issues I've mentioned so far are more from the perspective of a first playthrough rather than playthrough 8 or whatever. Of course, knowing exactly where the Mega Sword of Uber Death is going to make the game easier. The issue is that the spiky metal monstrosity of Spinal Annihilation is just sitting in some low-level cave, and it's super easy to find on accident, instead of finding it by deliberate, pre-planned effort. Anyway, that's enough for this time. This video has ended up being longer than the other ones so far. I just have a lot more to say about progression. It's one of the things that I probably talk about the most when I talk about Morrowind. On an unrelated note, Starfield just really isn't grabbing me like I thought it would. It's a modern Bethesda game and it's filled with modern Bethesda game. I really should do a video on how much I hate Fallout 3, Skyrim, and Fallout 4's writing. Because Morrowind and Oblivion just have much better writing than these late-period Bethesda games. I guess Starfield is a poorly written, late-stage Bethesda game as well, at least so far. There's a chance I'm just, completely missing the best written stuff in the game, but I kinda doubt it. Also, yeah, I'll defend Oblivion's writing is good. There's a lot of good in it, even if it is buried under a thick layer of potato faces and trying to squeeze the game onto an Xbox 360. It's definitely more poorly written than Morrowind, but Morrowind was the product of a lot of very creative people in their creative prime, firing on all cylinders while actively going out of business. Anyway, I've been here long enough. I have a Patreon linked below, and I should have Discord access worked out there by the time this video goes up. It used to be open to everyone, but that was becoming difficult to moderate, so yeah. Cheers. Have a good day or night or whatever it is now.